September 15, 1944, the transition from the chaos of the landing to the grim reality of the beachhead was instantaneous. The grey, smoke-choked sand was not a resting place. It was a slaughterhouse. Relentless fire poured from the Japanese blockhouse positioned on the point. This concrete bunker was the nexus of the defense. It required immediate and specialized attention from the Marines. Amidst the shredded palm stumps and chunks of coral, men struggled to find their bearings. They were daubed in camouflage paint. Their faces were blank with shock. The dead bled silently into the sand, unnoticed in the maelstrom. The narrator's first imperative was finding a familiar face he needed, a voice that could cut through the roaring disorder of the beach. He found John first, kneeling beside a man whose injuries were beyond hope. John, typically stoic, offered a surprising moment of gentleness. He cleaned a cut on the narrator's head, dismissing it as only a fat cut and a crease. This small act re-established a fragile human connection in a landscape stripped of humanity. Soon after, the narrator spotted Buck, the scout sergeant. Buck's presence was a lodestone of practical guidance. Despite his pervasive pessimism, Buck was a veteran of Guadalcanal. His very existence confirmed that survival was possible here. This small reunion re-established purpose when the strategic map had dissolved into individual terror. The tactical situation remained dire. The beach was a bottleneck, littered with destroyed equipment. Recognizing the necessity of firepower further inland, the narrator acted. He managed to convince a skeptical tank lieutenant to move his Shermans off the exposed shore. The rumble of the tanks was heavy, grinding, and reassuringly American. As they lumbered toward the designated airfield zone, the shift began. This marked the first tangible move from desperate defense to offensive posture. It was a small gain, but it gave the Marines a desperately needed foothold to push forward. This initial optimism, however, was a fleeting illusion. It was shattered by the grinding reality of the Japanese defense. Command had promised a decisive 3-day victory, but the battalion journal-keeper, Milt, voiced a grim premonition. He told the men this would be a long and dirty business. The Japanese strategy relied on deeply entrenched pillboxes and caves. This defense, designed for attrition, made accurate assessment of enemy strength impossible. It guaranteed prolonged and brutal fighting. The true nature of the dirty business was revealed during the next major attack. The relative quiet that sometimes settled over the front was a lie. It was merely a prelude to annihilation. The Japanese unleashed a devastating barrage of artillery and mortars, and men described these as walking mortars and black cyclones of dust. The earth spurted, fire flashed, and the air whirred with shrapnel. Under this overwhelming intensity, the narrator felt his psychological walls crumble. He was paralyzed on open ground. They were seized by a fear so profound it stopped him cold. He was unable to move forward or back, his body refusing the commands of his will. In that moment of total psychological collapse, John appeared. There was no gentle guidance, and was only the brutal, necessary discipline of survival. John administered a dose of intelligent cruelty. He physically stopped the narrator's panicked flight. His hands forced the narrator down and forward. It was a violent, shocking intervention. It served as a reminder that on Peleliu, the enemy of self was often self. Survival sometimes required being saved from one's own fear by the harsh actions of a comrade. The ensuing Japanese counterattack, launched immediately after the barrage, was a close-quarters slugging match. Tanks emerged from the smoke, followed by infantry. The Marines were forced to defend desperately from the bank. The exhilaration of seeing a bazooka team disable a Japanese tank brought cheers of childlike joy, but this joy was quickly swallowed by the ferocity of the combat. It was a battle of attrition, fought hand to hand and foxhole to foxhole. This underscored the vital importance of small unit cohesion. Training allowed men to function even when their organized units had dissolved, and intense firing finally subsided. The air was thick with smoke. Across the ravaged ground, the pervasive, desperate cry for corpsmen rang out. This was the unglamorous reality of war. It was not glory, but survival, fear, and the profound physical cost of every inch of ground gained. October 3rd, 1940-4, 18 days after the amphibious assault, the survivors of Peleliu departed the island. They left behind a scarred, shell-blasted landscape. They also left the ghosts of their comrades. They were the remnants, thrown together on a hillside that still smelled of salt, and spent ordnance there. Their minds operated under a profound psychological detachment. The narrator called it a resignation from the human race. The sheer scale of the death had blurred the line between friend and foe. The primary impulse had become simple annihilation. As they pulled away, the final sounds were the mingled cries of Americans and Japanese on the higher ridge. They were still screaming for corpsman or illumination. Their pleas were absorbed by the indifferent night. The return to the rest base of Pavuvu was jarring. It was a place of relative safety, but it was not peace. The psychological weight of the campaign was crushing. The knowledge that they had survived when so many had not was heavier than any pack they had ever humped. The transition back toward the awkward reality of normalcy was almost unbearable. They had to learn, becoming a human again, after some time away from being one. The narrator described the process as moving from crawling on his stomach to walking erect. He said the feeling was awful. The depth of their isolation was painfully underscored by the well-meaning ignorance of those in the rear. When a sailor offered cheerful comfort, saying, "You gave it to 'em real good, boys," an F Company rifleman responded with a devastating truth that encapsulated their entire experience. He simply said, "We got beat." In the damp tents of Pavuvu, attempts at recovery were fragile. Bob meticulously made coffee and tidied their tent. He clung to routine as an anchor against chaos. Buck, ever the pragmatist, urged the narrator to unwind, yet the trauma manifested in sleeplessness and nightmares. They were physically safe, but the war continued internally. The necessary confrontation with loss came in the form of the wake on Pavuvu. This ritualized, messy grieving forced the shattered units to acknowledge their immense cost. News of the wounded trickled in slowly. Stash, burned by a flamethrower, had survived with scarring. Reb had sustained minor injuries.
But the news of Wingy brought a particular sorrow. Wingy, the skinny blonde boy who couldn't read a map, had manned the machine gun.
He had been machine-gunned in the stomach and died en route to the hospital ship. Wingy's brother, stoic yet visibly pained, requested a final duty. He asked the narrator to write to their mother. He insisted the letter emphasize Wingy's courage, shielding her from the brutal, unglamorous manner of his death. For 10 days, an outlying island offered a temporary, idyllic reprieve. The men called them the longest, shortest days. Amidst white beaches, clear waters, and lush forests, the Marines fished, hunted, and swam. A simple shower felt like a profound cleansing. It peeled away the grime and some of the war. They let their watches run down, choosing to live only by the sun. They embraced the simple pleasures of a Pacific paradise. Yet even here the war lingered beneath the surface. The constant anticipation of the next campaign fueled widespread nervousness and sleeplessness. The vacuum created by this waiting, combined with profound psychological stress, became fertile ground for rumor. This psychological strain manifested most powerfully in the terrifying legend of the Mad Ghoul. The ghoul was described as a dark figure with fur gloves and eyes like a great big snake. He was said to slash mosquito netting on moonlight nights. This story was more than just folklore. It was the embodiment of the Marines' own unacknowledged terror. Having endured the physical horror of Peleliu, their minds now conjured a new, internal enemy. The pervasive fear demonstrated that Marines were acutely susceptible to psychological pressures. Isolation and anticipation blurred the line between reality and dark, imagined threats. The ghoul was the trauma given a name. It was a chilling reminder that even in paradise the war inside them had not ended. April 1st, 1945. The landing on Okinawa was a study in profound, almost absurd contrast to previous battles. Aboard the Higgins boats, men did not chew dry toast or stare into blinding chaos. Instead, they read paperback books and chatted about baseball. They compared the scene to a peaceful day at Coney Island. This was the greatest gathering of ships in history. Engineers blew gaps through the sea wall. Grassy hills rolled back gently to Yontan Airfield. Initial reports filtering back were deceptively reassuring. They cited light to moderate resistance. It felt like a soft campaign or a picnic. This period of camping out at government expense fostered a dangerous sense of security, yet this calm was a masterpiece of Japanese deception. The enemy had chosen to abandon the beaches and the initial defensive line. They were luring the Americans inland. There, they had meticulously constructed a defense-in-depth system. This system would make Peleliu look like a skirmish. The surreal quiet was violently broken only once. A distant, terrifying scream of a kamikaze plane diving into a transport ship punctuated the calm. It reminded every man of the true, omnipresent nature of the war. As the Marines pushed inland, the houses of a fishing village stood intact. They were made of plywood and cardboard, utterly unlike the pulverized coral of previous battlegrounds. The realization of the deception dawned not with a bang, it came with radio reports of mounting casualties and distress calls. The 6th Marine Division was caught in the ambush that the 1st Division had seemingly glided past. The picnic phase ended with the inevitable order. They had to advance south toward the formidable Naha-Shuri line. It was the island's strategic heart. The Japanese were dug in stubbornly, fanatically, desperately, within a maze of caves and fortified positions. The fighting immediately devolved into a grinding, slogging attrition. It was as dull and relentless as office routine. Every gain came at an immense human cost. The psychological toll of this unending pressure was immediate and pervasive. Men developed superstitions. The pervasive fear led to widespread sleeplessness. The strain of reconciling the constant presence of death with the distant reality of home was almost impossible. Even basic safety became a matter of luck, not strategy. It was during this period of intense anxiety that the random cruelty of combat struck close to the narrator. One night, amidst the jittery vigilance that settled over the perimeter, John left his foxhole. John was the stoic Marine who had saved the narrator from paralyzing fear on Peleliu. Perhaps he was restless, seeking a moment of solitude. In the darkness, a trigger-happy comrade mistook the movement for a Japanese approach. This man's nerves were frayed past the breaking point by exhaustion and threat. A burst of fire ripped through the night. John fell. A victim of friendly fire, it was a tragic, arbitrary end. It underscored the chaotic, senseless nature of war far more profoundly than any enemy shell ever could. The shock and grief were immense. Buck, the veteran scout sergeant, reacted with a burning, terrible desire for revenge. His loyalty to his fallen comrade transformed into a fierce, focused rage. John's death, random and meaningless, was a deep cut into the fragile bonds of the unit. It also reinforced the protective ferocity of those who remained. The offensive ground on focused on breaking the Naha-Shuri line, and the fighting for key terrain was relentless. Hard-won knobs like Nan, 60, and especially Sugarloaf were transformed into meat grinders. These were not glorious sweeping advances. They were slow, costly struggles for inches. There's been demonstrated the extreme price of minor territorial gains. The landscape itself became a cruel enemy. The rainy season had begun, turning the terrain into a swamp. Mud was described as glaciers of mud. Hills ripped by shellfire seemed to bleed mud. Every movement became a struggle. The poor supply lines and a lack of coordination between the Marines and the Army heightened the danger. The physical and psychological strain began to crack even the most hardened men. The heat was a constant torment, even before the rains came. Temperatures exceeded 115 degrees, men's faces broiled, lips cracked, and eyes became almost sightless from the glare and exhaustion. The relentless push forward culminated in a desperate, nearly suicidal assault on a sheer cliff face. It was a seemingly insurmountable objective. Platoons were reduced to the size of squads. Companies were reduced to large platoons. They clawed their way up the steep, cave-riddled face. They advanced under a hail of grenades and close-quarters combat. The screams of E Company machine gunners, trapped and dying, echoed across the ridges. It was a terrifying symphony of attrition. The decision to attack such an objective symbolized the relentless, unforgiving nature of the offensive. It was a costly, necessary push forward, regardless of the human price. The order to move out softly was swallowed by the darkness. The night advance on Kunishi Ridge was a relentless, stumbling ordeal over broken ground. The very earth seemed hostile to movement. The narrator fought a profound, disorienting fatigue. He began counting paces. 1, 2, 3. This desperate, internal rhythm was meant to anchor his mind and control his fear. The silence was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum, ready to explode. Ahead, a nervous soldier broke the tension with a fearful whisper. "It will be daylight soon. It will be daylight soon," he repeated. The sergeant finally silenced him with a sharp, whispered command. Then, the night tore open. A sudden, brilliant green flare erupted, hanging impossibly high. It turned the landscape into a stark, momentary photograph. Before the light died, the ratcheting sound of a Japanese Nambu automatic weapon ripped through the darkness. This was followed instantly by a hail of rifle fire. The burst of light signaled the transition to total chaos. Men scrambled, running blind into a gully. They were desperate to cross an unprotected gap in a low ridge. The air was thick with the whisper of fire and the sting of rock fragments. The narrator, lost in the crush of running men, felt the heat of a sniper's shot pass close to his neck. The near miss was a physical shock that propelled him forward. He was walking in his sleep, a functional automaton. There, he was driven only by the primal urge to survive one more minute. The wound, when it came mortar fragments peppering his leg, was almost a relief. It was a physical punctuation mark on an endless sentence of violence. His evacuation offered a profound shift in perspective. This forced removal allowed his mind to slowly, painfully begin to process the war as a whole. This shift crystallized during an intelligence detail in the immediate rear. The narrator and a comrade, Tony, were tasked with searching the bodies of deceased Japanese soldiers. It was a grim, necessary ritual. They inventoried the wet, sodden pockets, expecting only military artifacts. But in the uniform of one dead rifleman, they found a small water-stained packet of family photographs. The images of a wife and children were ordinary and deeply personal. They smashed the edifice of hatred that combat had required. The enemy was not a monster, but a man. He was separated from his family by an ocean of ideology and violence. The discovery resonated deeply when the translator revealed that the deceased soldier was a poet. The narrator's hatred yielded to a weary, profound pity. They recognized the shared, tragic humanity of the enemy. Meanwhile, the relentless pressure on the Naha-Shuri line finally cracked. The Japanese main defense, fought over for weeks with staggering loss, began to crumble. This forced a strategic retreat south. The war was ending, not with a glorious charge, but with a slow, muddy, exhausted grind. Far from the chaos of the gully, the war ended for the Japanese High Command. As the pre-dawn darkness still held Okinawa captive, they performed an act of stark, ceremonial finality. General Ushijima and his chief of staff Cho appeared at the mouth of their cave headquarters. Ushijima, dressed in his full field uniform, prepared for ritual suicide. He paused, remarking with chilling detachment that he would take his fan since it was getting warm. At precisely 4 o'clock, the appointed hour for their harikiri, the generals began their ceremonial end. It was an organized, symbolic conclusion. It was a final act of discipline played out in silence. It was a world away from the desperate, chaotic terror of the individual Marine scrambling for cover just hours before. The simple act of changing his socks marked the narrator's personal defiance. It was a gesture against the rot and filth of the line. It symbolized his psychological exit from the war. He was pulled out of the gully, leaving the chaos of Kunishi Ridge behind. The ridge was still humming with the sounds of the battle he had just left. The journey from the front was a jarring transition. It was a rapid descent from the razor's edge of survival back toward the civilized world. He was transported first by truck, then by ambulance. The jarring motion did little to soothe the aches of his mortar-fragmented leg. It did not ease the chronic weariness settled deep in his bones. The smell of antiseptic and clean linen on the hospital ship was a shock. It overpowered the pervasive stench of cordite and death that had defined his existence for months. Here the world was white, ordered, and quiet. It was an alien realm where men lay in beds instead of foxholes. Yet the mind remained stuck in the mud. Many of the wounded carried the Aleutian stare. Their eyes had seen too much and now focused on nothing. They were unable to reconcile the sudden cessation of threat with the ingrained habit of vigilance. Sleep was not rest. It was a series of quick, shallow plunges into nightmares. The inability to wake properly blurred the line between the terror of the ridge and the safety of the cot. The war had taught them to measure existence in paces and seconds. That psychological programming did not simply switch off. As the narrator recovered, the Pacific War was reaching its fever pitch. It was a final, terrible push towards the Japanese home islands. Rumors of the planned invasion, Operation Olympic, circulated among the recovering men. The sheer scale of the casualty estimates was staggering. It confirmed the Marines' grim premonition. The fighting on Honshu and Kyushu would make Peleliu look like a training exercise. The psychological burden of this looming final battle was immense. They knew they were merely patching up to be thrown back into an even greater meat grinder. Then the world changed. The news arrived not through an official communique, but as a whisper. That whisper gained volume and velocity across the hospital wards. First came the incredible reports of the bombs. 2 cities had vanished in fire and smoke. Then came the almost incomprehensible announcement: the Japanese were surrendering. When VJ Day finally broke, it was not met with cinematic explosions of joy. It was met with a profound, stunned silence. The relief was overwhelming and crushing, yet complicated by disbelief. The Marines had been conditioned to expect death. They anticipated the next charge, the next cave, the final bloody invasion. Peace was an abstract concept. It was an illogical end to the endless violence. The celebrations that erupted in the rear areas were chaotic and strangely anticlimactic. Men fired machine guns into the air, yelling until their throats were raw. They were releasing months of pent-up tension in a single cathartic burst. Yet for many, like the narrator, the feeling was more akin to emptiness. The defining purpose of their lives, to kill and survive, had suddenly evaporated. The true emotional reckoning came later, when the noise died down. The war was over, but the men who had fought it were still there. They were physically whole, but psychologically fractured. They were now survivors of the Great Pacific Crucible. They had to learn how to be men again. They had to move from crawling on their stomachs to walking erect. The transition felt awkward and unnatural. The intense bonds of brotherhood, forged in shared terror, were now tested.
They faced the return to individual civilian life. They had survived the ultimate test of combat.
But the journey of becoming a human again, after some time away from being one, had just begun. They were homebound. The baggage they carried was invisible, heavier than any pack they had ever worn across the coral. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.